So how should I sit? What should I do with my hands?
This, you can leave them to your.
Oh, it's just up here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Here up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. And you just look straight at this beautiful young lady.
Okay.
All right, you ready? All right, say your first and last name and spell it, please.
Kathleen Cleaver, Kathleen, and Cleaver is Cleaver.
All right, very good. All right, so tell me what years you worked in Atlanta and what you did there.
I came to Atlanta from the New York office of SNCC in January of 1967. I had been in New York for about a few months and learned about SNCC, but I was asked to come to the national headquarters by George Ware, who had been in the Tuskegee student movement and had graduated and started working. But now he wants to return back to the South and back to the movement because one of the students at Tuskegee whom he worked with in their Tuskegee student movement that was part of SNCC had been murdered. And he felt so distraught. And in some sense, he felt because he had been the leader of this movement and he was more mature, that he was somehow responsible. So Sammy Young had been murdered in Tuskegee in December, I think. And so in January, he moved to back to Atlanta after he got a master's degree in chemistry at Tuskegee. And he said, Kathleen, I want you to come and work with me. And I would say George Ware was probably one of the most brilliant men I'd ever met. And he was very analytical and he was committed, and I leaped at the chance to go and work with him. And his best friend was also my boyfriend, so it all worked.
And then how old were you at the time?
I was 21 years old.
Oh, well, include part of my question in it.
When I moved to Atlanta, I was 21 years old, and as my father said, I was more or less an adult, and I had chosen to drop out of college and devote my time to the civil rights movement, and I made a deal. I said, well, I'm not learning that much in college, so why don't you give me the tuition that you're paying the school, and I will support myself in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because at that time, because of the call for Black Power, a huge amount of the donors, the financial base of SNCC was mostly white and North, and Black Power was not something that they approved of particularly, and so the financial base of SNCC was in a state of collapse. So my father agreed and gave me monthly checks that he would have been sending to Barnard College. And I could support not only myself, but the campus program.
Right. And then how was SNCC different from CORE and SCLC? How did you guys stand out for those two programs?
I had no connection with SCLC other than what I would read about. SNCC, CORE, and SCLC would collaborate. However, the SCLC was based in churches, and the leaders were preachers, and preachers who had churches. So they had a structure based on the church, and it was a lot of male authority in SCLC. Ella Baker had worked in SCLC, but she became sort of the guiding spirit for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was more flexible, had a lot more women, and was not committed ahead of time to a particular structure like a church would have been. CORE was based in the North, unlike SCLC, which was created essentially after the Montgomery bus movement. You have to understand, at this time, the NAACP had become a banned organization in the South because of the hostility. And so people who had previously been in NAACP developed small movements, and Ella Baker was one of the people who was very active and helped SNCC and SNCC activists get their bearings. And SNCC was more flexible. SNCC gave women much more say-so, and it was more daring. Sammy Young, the student had been killed, was working with SNCC, and I knew him. and I was from Tuskegee, so I was very comfortable moving down to Atlanta and working with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and I really doubt seriously I could have gone to SCLC.
And then, all right, so talk about, because I know you said you got to SNCC on the latter part of the decade, and then that's when it was transitioning, and then, so talk about that as well as how it sort of transitioned to the Black Power movement, if you may.
I was at Barnard in New York as a college student when Stokely Carmichael in Mississippi during the Meredith March sort of switched the call. It was a famous moment. The marchers would stop and some people would say, what do you want? Freedom now. And Willie Ricks would go through the crowd and say, no, we want Black Power, we want Black Power. And so at the footage on television that came out was Stokely Carmichael standing on the back of a truck in the dark Mississippi night saying, what do we want? And the crowd shouting, Black Power, and Black Power, Black Power. And it was a dramatic moment. And you would have thought he had set the White House on fire. I mean, the country went berserk. Martin Luther King was generous. He said, I think it was a bad choice, unfortunate choice of words. Well, those of us who were younger and really kind of not that, particularly Northern students, were not that impressed with passive resistance and nonviolence. They didn't like the idea of watching all these young people get beat up. And so the turn to Black Power also included more orientation towards self-defense, also more of a direction away from integration and into Black solidarity, led by Stokely Carmichael, who had become influenced by Frantz Fanon, the French psychiatrist who was part of the Algerian Revolution, and once his work was translated into English. And so we were moving into an ideologically different and politically different arena, and I loved it. I was so excited. This was revolutionary. This is where I wanted to be.
And then it's been 40 years since SNCC. How has it changed your life?
Well, I will say that because I was in SNCC in Atlanta, and the unit, the program of SNCC that I was attached to was something called the campus program. The campus program's role was to recruit college students to come back into the movement. SNCC had come off the college campuses, but now all these people had grown up and they were mature and they wanted to generate new excitement, and the campus program went to college campuses in the South and talked to students and encouraged them to participate in SNCC or join SNCC or form Friends of SNCC and raise money. So my job was the secretary of the campus program. The other people in the campus program, who were George Ware, Samuel Schutz, and Ernest Stevens, would travel and they'd go to the campuses and I'd stay in Atlanta and I'd type up the reports and I'd answer the phone. But I didn't really travel with them. But we all lived together like a little commune. We lived in an apartment in Atlanta. No one had cars, so we'd hitchhike to work. And I would always be at the office. And I remember reading some reports that said, well, Kathleen always comes in late. Yeah, because I worked there until very, very late in the evening. So that I was a good worker, I was a hard worker, but I didn't like to get up in the morning. And so I would work really maybe from 10 to 10. And so we organized a conference to pull together these groups of students that SNCC had influenced or SNCC was working with. It was called Liberation Will Come From a Black Thing. So this is a conference for April, I think it was March, it was Easter weekend of 1967. And so I think it was one of the earliest Black Power student conferences. Black Power had made it, Stokely Carmichael and SNCC had become identified with Black Power in May or June. And now here we are in March of the 67, May or June of 66, March of 67, a conference of Black Power-oriented student groups and students. And I was the person who mailed out and wrote out the invitations. And one of the people we invited Amiri Baraka, who was then called Leroy Jones. We invited Margaret Randall, Walker, a writer in Mississippi, different intellectuals and leaders that we thought would be helpful for our understanding. So we also invited a writer named Eldridge Cleaver, who lived in California and wrote for the unheard of thing. He was a black nationalist ex-convict, and he wrote for this white radical magazine called Rampart. So that's a very standout. And he wrote very radical things. So we were taken by what he wrote, and he was one of the people who was invited. And I typed out the letter and mailed them all, and he called up to accept, and he told me I spelled his name wrong. And I still make typographical errors. But I just remember that. And so we met at the day that the conference had been kicked off the campus of Fisk. It was too radical for Fisk. Stokely Carmichael was now associated, Black Power meant violence, Stokely Carmichael is part of SNCC, you can't be on our campus. So they had thrown us off the campus. All the students